Panic-stricken screams echoed as the plane shook violently. The lights flickered out, and oxygen masks fell from above. In chaos, the plane was in free fall. Some passengers screamed, clinging desperately to their loved ones. Flight attendants tried to stay calm, but fear was visible in their eyes. "Mayday! Mayday! We've lost control!" the captain screamed in desperation. The cockpit was filled with the deafening sound of alarms, and the controls were useless, as the plane's systems were completely disabled. A violent storm raged outside, tearing through the sky. Inside the cabin, it felt like hell had descended. Amidst the chaos, a tiny 5-year-old girl became the last glimmer of hope. "We need someone small enough to crawl into the maintenance compartment. If not, this is the end," the co-pilot urgently announced. But who could do this? No one dared to step forward. Everyone knew that even one mistake would send the plane plummeting with no chance of survival. Suddenly, a small voice cut through the air. "I'll do it." The entire cabin fell silent. 275 people held their breath as they turned to look at Jane. Her small body trembled, but her eyes filled with determination. Her mother, Kate, grabbed her tiny hand, her eyes red with both fear and pride. "I believe in you, Jane. You're the bravest person I've ever known." There was no time for fear, no way out, 90 seconds to live or die. Jane was guided by the flight attendants to a small door leading to the maintenance compartment. When it opened, a gust of cold air rushed in. The space was pitch black and cramped, barely enough for a child. Jane's small hands trembled as she searched through a tangle of wires. One small mistake, and everything would plummet into the abyss. Outside, the captain screamed, "We have only 60 seconds." Jane closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and listened to the instructions through the radio, trying not to let fear consume her. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Jane, plug in the last wire now." She swallowed hard, her tiny fingers trembling as they reached for the wire that would decide the fate of 275 lives. Would she succeed, or would they all fall into eternal darkness? Do you believe a 5-year-old girl could do the impossible? Hit subscribe now so you don't miss out on more emotional and thrilling stories like this. The airport was bustling with people rushing about, each carrying their own luggage and personal stories. Among the crowd, Kate held the hand of her 5-year-old daughter, Jane, whose eyes sparkled with excitement. Today was the most special day of Jane's life, a day when she and her mother were finally traveling together to Disney World, the magical place Jane had always dreamed of visiting. From the moment they stepped into the airport, Jane chattered nonstop, pointing at everything around her as if she wanted to memorize every detail. "Mom, look! The airplane is huge," she exclaimed, her small hand tugging at her mother's sleeve, her little feet bouncing with excitement. Kate smiled and gently stroked her daughter's hair. "Yes, honey. Soon we'll be sitting on one just like it." They arrived at the check-in area, where a long line of passengers waited patiently for their turn. Jane watched the airport staff with fascination, her eyes lighting up when she saw a boy adjusting his backpack with his parents. "Mom, can I say hi to him?" Jane asked, looking up at her mother with hopeful eyes. Kate nodded with a smile, encouraging her, and immediately Jane ran over to wave at the boy. "Hi, are you going to Disney too?" The boy seemed shy at first, but soon he smiled and replied. The two children quickly started chatting, talking about their favorite cartoon characters and the rides they were looking forward to. Seeing Jane so happy, Kate felt a weight lift from her heart. She had worried that Jane might be sad about not having her father with them on this trip, but at this moment, her daughter was completely content. After completing the check-in process, they made their way to the security checkpoint. Jane curiously watched everything: the luggage scanners, the way the staff signaled for passengers to move along. When it was their turn, she raised her hand high as she passed through the scanner, imitating the adults, which made a few staff members smile. Kate laughed softly, pulling her daughter closer and adjusting her small backpack. "You need to be good on the plane, okay?" Jane nodded enthusiastically, though her eyes still shone with excitement. They entered the waiting area, where Jane ran straight to the large window where she could see the massive airplanes parked on the runway. She pressed her face against the glass, her eyes wide with delight as she watched an airplane slowly begin to taxi, preparing for takeoff. "Mom, it's flying. Are we going to fly like that too?" Kate nodded, then glanced at the clock. There was still an hour before their flight, plenty of time to stroll around the shopping area. She took her daughter's hand and led her past souvenir shops, snack stands, and tempting treats. Jane stopped in front of a sticker stand, staring intently at a colorful collection of Disney-themed decals. She carefully picked out a set with Mickey Mouse on it, and then turned to her mom with expectant eyes. "Mom, can we buy this?" Kate nodded, taking out her wallet to pay. When the cashier handed the stickers back, she surprised them by adding a smaller one. "This is a lucky sticker, wishing you both a wonderful trip." Jane's eyes widened in surprise, and she squealed with joy. "Mom, it says Bona on it." Kate smiled, patting her daughter's head. "Then let's stick it on your backpack so it brings us luck on this trip." Under the warm, golden lights of the airport, the two sat down on a long bench, nibbling on some snacks while watching other passengers busy with their own journeys. Everything seemed perfect, a trip to look forward to, a great start to the adventure. But despite trying to enjoy the moment, Kate couldn't shake a strange feeling. A vague sense of unease crept into her mind, as if something was about to happen. She told herself it was just the stress from all the preparation in the past few months, yet deep down, that nagging feeling remained, lingering, not letting go. The steady hum of the engines resonated through the airplane cabin. Jane had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, her breathing light and her face relaxed like a little angel. Kate gently stroked her daughter's hair, smiling down at her innocent face. She leaned back in her seat, intending to rest for a moment, but a sudden feeling of unease swept over her, causing her to shiver slightly. Outside the window, the sky was no longer the clear blue it had been when they took off. Dark clouds were gathering, blocking the sunlight and casting an ominous, gloomy atmosphere. Kate furrowed her brow, trying to reassure herself that it was just an ordinary storm. But then she felt a slight tremor in the plane. A gust of wind passed through, and a few seconds later, the airplane shook again, this time more noticeably. Some passengers began exchanging nervous glances, and soft whispers filled the cabin. A man sitting near the aisle turned to his wife and asked, "Did you feel that shake?" The woman nodded, her eyes reflecting the same concern. Up front, an elderly woman gripped her armrest tightly, her lips pressed together in tension. Even the flight attendants, though maintaining their professional smiles, couldn't hide the cautious look in their eyes as they checked on the passengers. The plane continued to shake lightly, then began to tremble more forcefully. A middle-aged man near the window looked out, muttering, oh no, we're heading into a storm." Kate turned to look outside the window and felt her heart sink. The sky had darkened, and flashes of lightning appeared in the distance, reflecting off the plane's wing like sharp slashes across the dark sky. Suddenly, the captain's deep, tense voice came through the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are entering a rough weather zone. For your safety, please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts." A silence fell over the cabin for a few seconds, followed by the rustling sounds of passengers obeying the instructions. Some tried to stay calm by continuing to watch movies or read books, but the sense of anxiety began to spread unmistakably. Kate tightened her seat belt and pulled Jane closer into her arms. Though she didn't want to wake her daughter, an unease settled within her that she couldn't ignore. Jane stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. "Mom, are we there yet?" she mumbled, still groggy. Kate smiled reassuringly. "Not yet, sweetheart, but we'll be there soon. Go ahead and sleep a little longer." Jane nodded, but seemed to sense the unusual atmosphere and clung to her mother's arm even more tightly. Outside, the winds howled even stronger, and the cabin suddenly jolted harder. A young woman in the back gasped but fell silent when a flight attendant approached her, speaking softly to reassure her. "Everything is under control. Please don't worry. It's just some mild turbulence." But in the flight attendant's eyes, Kate caught a brief flicker of tension. A massive crash sounded from afar as a gigantic bolt of lightning tore through the sky next to the plane. The blinding light flooded the cabin for a moment, causing several passengers to scream in fear. At that instant, the captain's voice returned, now sounding more urgent. "We're entering a severe storm. Please remain seated, fasten your seat belts, and follow the crew's instructions." Kate felt her heart tighten. She clutched her daughter's hand, trying to keep her voice as calm as possible. "It's okay, honey. Mommy's here with you." But inside, The unease continued to grow. The plane shook even more violently, as if an invisible hand had seized it and was shaking it relentlessly. Jane buried her face in her mother's chest, while the passengers around them began to whisper prayers. The storm ahead was growing more terrifying. Kate knew that this was only the beginning of something horrific that was about to unfold. The roar of the engines merged with the howling wind, sounding like an enraged monster. The airplane plunged straight into thick black clouds, swallowed by the furious storm. Blinding flashes of lightning struck like massive swords, ripping through the sky and reflecting cold light off the plane's body. A heavy sense of dread filled the cabin, as though everything were being sucked into an invisible trap. Kate gripped Jane's hand as her daughter curled into her once clear eyes now gleaming with fear. The shaking grew stronger, like an invisible giant hand was trying to crush the plane. Around them, passengers began murmuring, their whispers mixed with heavy breaths. An elderly couple in front of them clung tightly to each other, the woman whispering prayers while the old man squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with worry. And then, suddenly, boom. A deafening explosion sounded from somewhere outside, echoing throughout the cabin like a bomb going off. A massive bolt of lightning struck the plane directly, shaking the entire cabin as if it had just been punched by an invisible giant. Blinding light flashed for a split second, reflecting on the terrified faces of the passengers before everything plunged into absolute darkness. The captain screamed over the intercom, but the communication system was garbled, his voice distorting into broken, disconnected sounds. "We've lost control, please," and then fell silent. The lights in the cabin went out. There was no light except for the continuous flashes of lightning outside the window. For the first few seconds, there was nothing but terrifying silence. No one had time to understand what had just happened. Then, suddenly, the plane fell free. Fell. There was no sense of gravity. All the passengers seemed to be lifted from their seats for a brief, but seemingly endless moment. A surreal feeling overwhelmed Kate's entire body as she felt herself floating in midair, bound by anything. But then crash. The plane jerked violently downwards, and everyone was thrown back into their seats, their heads spinning. "We're falling. Oh my God, we're going to die," a woman screamed in desperation, her voice breaking in the chaos. A child in the row behind them wailed loudly. A man tried to open the overhead compartment to grab something, but at that moment, a large suitcase fell directly onto his head, sending him crashing to the floor with a painful scream. Outside, the wind screamed like angry spirits. The plane continued to plummet, shaking harder than ever. Kate's hands trembled as she urgently pulled the oxygen mask down for Jane. The little girl cried uncontrollably, her eyes blurred with tears, but she still tried to follow her mother's instructions. Kate quickly donned her own mask, but her chest tightened from the lack of oxygen, each gasping breath feeling like an invisible hand was choking her. Boom. Another explosion rang out, this time from beneath the plane. Some passengers screamed, "Fire! There's fire under the wing." A man stood up, trying to run toward the aisle, but was immediately pulled back by a flight attendant. "Sit down now. Put on your mask." But he ignored her, struggling wildly. Another violent shake sent him tumbling to the aisle. Jane clung tightly to her mother, sobbing, "Mom, I'm so scared. Don't leave me." Kate hugged her tightly, her lips trembling as she whispered in her daughter's ear, "I will never leave you. Never." The alarms from the system continued to blare, but all that could be heard were the beeps and the distorted voices of the crew. The captain, with one final effort, sent out an emergency signal. "Mayday! Mayday! We've lost control." But no one knew if the signal reached the ground. Tears streamed down Kate's face. She could feel every passing second, knowing it could be the last moment. The plane kept falling, the lightning still tearing through the sky. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the lightning or the howling wind. It was the helplessness, the feeling of falling into an endless abyss with no way out. Kate closed her eyes, holding Jane tighter than ever before. Around them, the screams, cries, and prayers rang out like a desperate symphony of people facing their fate. And then, boom. A horrifying impact sent the entire cabin into a violent tilt. A burst of blinding light flashed from the front of the plane, and everything seemed to explode into uncontrollable chaos. Everything around Kate vanished. She could no longer feel anything, No more screams, no more light, no more Jane in her arms. There was only an endless night swallowing her whole. The cabin was engulfed in darkness. No light, no signals from the cockpit. A moment of eerie silence stretched for less than a second, but felt like an eternity. And then, suddenly, a scream tore through the air. Chaos erupted throughout the cabin. People were screaming, praying, calling out for their loved ones, while some passengers, shaking in fear, tried to pull down their oxygen masks. The cries of children echoed through the space. A middle-aged man, unable to control his panic, tried to stand and rush towards the flight attendants, but was immediately knocked to the floor by the force of inertia. Another passenger gripped the armrest tightly, his face pale, his eyes wide, and staring into the empty space ahead as though he had already seen death. Kate held Jane tight in her arms, feeling her heartbeat race, her breath shallow and panicked. Mom, are we going to die? Jane sobbed. Kate shook her head quickly, her voice trembling but trying to remain calm. No, sweetheart. I'm here. I'll protect you. But the truth was, she didn't know if they would survive. Flight attendants moved with difficulty through the violent shakes of the plane, trying to shout instructions. Everyone, stay in your seats. Put on your oxygen masks immediately. Tighten your seat belts. But no one could hear anything except the screams and the terrifying rumbling of the plane shaking violently. A sudden jolt sent a flight attendant crashing into the cabin wall. She cried out in pain but managed to stand again, clinging to the armrest, her eyes dazed as she saw the passengers around her panicking. A strange noise came from the plane's right wing, a sound like cracking, as if metal was being stretched to its breaking point. Kate looked out the window in terror, and her heart stopped. A part of the wing was vibrating unnaturally, sparks flashing between the black storm clouds. She wanted to scream, but her throat was tight with fear. An older man, likely an engineer, realized the situation and shouted, "The wing is damaged. If it breaks off, we'll fall instantly." But no one was in the state to listen. A young woman, so panicked she started ripping at her shirt, muttered meaningless words as if she had completely lost control. A desperate father held his child tightly in his arms, his back trembling violently. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here." But his voice too cracked and faltered. Boom. Another lightning bolt struck close by, lighting up the cabin for an instant, revealing the terrified, helpless faces of the passengers. Fear at its peak. A violent jolt sent everyone lurching forward as though they were hurtling into oblivion. The cries, the screams, and the prayers melded into a terrifying symphony of people facing their fate. In that moment, Jane buried herself deeper into Kate's embrace, her tiny hands clutching at her mother's clothes. The little girl no longer screamed. She whispered shakily, "I don't want to die, Mom." Kate held her even tighter, tears streaming down her face, but she refused to let herself break down. "No, we won't die. I promise." But did she truly believe the words she was saying? The plane continued to fall free, shaking violently, thrown up and down in the swirl of the storm. Amid the chaos, the intercom crackled on. This time, the captain's voice was filled with tension but still trying to keep his calm. "This is the captain. We are trying to regain control. Please stay in your seats. Do not panic." But before he could finish, the signal suddenly cut off. That silence was more terrifying than the screams. A moment of horror engulfed everyone as they realized they were truly losing control completely. The plane now felt like a fragile leaf in the storm, with no way to escape. Suddenly, a sound of cracking came from beneath the plane. Kate froze in fear. Someone screamed, "Oh my God, the plane is coming apart." And at that moment, the airplane plunged down even faster, as if it were being sucked into an endless black hole. The warning alarms blared relentlessly, drowning the cockpit in chaos. Captain Elliot gripped the control yoke tightly, desperately trying to regain control, but it was futile. The screens before him flashed with bright red text, signaling that the system had been completely disabled. The altitude numbers continued to plummet uncontrollably. 20,000 feet, 18,000 feet, 15,000 feet. The plane was falling like a massive bullet streaking through the dark sky. Beside him, First Officer Mark Davidson frantically hammered at the auxiliary control panel, hoping to restart the system. His fingers trembled, slick with sweat, but everything remained pitch dark. There were no signs that the plane could recover. A distorted voice crackled in their headsets, not from air traffic control, but the sharp screech of static. They had lost contact with the ground. No one could help them. They were completely alone. Damn it, Mark screamed, his fist pounding the control panel in desperation, wanting to smash everything in sight. Captain Elliot immediately opened the emergency comm channel, his voice hoarse, blending with the howling wind outside. Mayday! Mayday! This is Flight 789. We have completely lost control. We are in free fall. Request immediate assistance. There was no response, just a deathly silence. No one could hear them. No one. Mark wiped the sweat from his forehead, his voice trembling. No one is answering, Elliot. No one's there. Elliot struggled to contain his panic, but his hand on the yoke tightened until his knuckles turned white. He turned to Mark, his voice cold but resolute. We can't wait for anyone to help. We have to save ourselves. But how? The plane had no engines, no control, nothing but the storm consuming them. Then, a sudden boom came from the plane's fuselage, so loud that the cockpit shook. A sharp crack sounded from the right wing. A piece of metal had torn off and flown straight out. Mark shouted, "The wing is coming off. If we don't do something now, we'll explode in midair." But Elliot knew there was nothing they could do from the cockpit. They had to restart the electrical system, and that system was in the maintenance compartment below. It was their last hope. Elliot hissed, "There's a way to restart the system," but he paused for a moment, looking at Mark with heavy eyes. The first officer, stunned, realized what the captain was about to say. They couldn't do it themselves. The maintenance compartment was too small, neither of them could fit into it. But without someone going in, the plane would keep falling until it crashed to the ground. A moment of silence filled the cockpit, thick and suffocating. The two pilots exchanged looks, neither daring to voice the question that was spinning in their minds. Who's small enough to get in there? And then, through the passenger monitoring screen, they saw a little girl huddled in her mother's arms. The girl was only 5 years old, but it was her eyes full of determination, that made Elliot catch his breath. For a split second, a crazy thought flashed through his mind. No, it couldn't be. But if they didn't try, they would all die. The cabin was enveloped in a dense atmosphere of fear. The dim lights flickered intermittently, casting distorted reflections on pale faces, wide eyes filled with terror. The warning systems on the plane blared relentlessly, a constant reminder that every second brought them closer to disaster. The plane continued to plummet, each jolt sending passengers crashing forward, only to be slammed back into their seats as if they were mere puppets in the fury of the monstrous storm outside. A flight attendant stepped forward, her voice trembling but struggling to stay calm. "Please, we need someone to get into the maintenance compartment. This is our only chance to save us all." Her words echoed through the chaotic space, but they were met with a deathly silence. No one responded. No one dared to stand. A middle-aged man dressed in a sharp suit shook his head, gripping the armrest as if it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. A young woman, tears streaming down her face, clutched her boyfriend, her body racked with sobs. A father sitting near the aisle hurriedly pulled his son close, whispering something inaudible amid the panic surrounding them. The child, about 8 years old, pale and trembling, buried his face into his father's chest, shaking like a leaf in the storm. A young man, perhaps an athlete, glanced toward the cockpit and then lowered his head, clenching his fists. His breath came in short, frantic gasps as though he were battling an internal war. But in a moment, he shook his head, his gaze shifting away, avoiding the responsibility that hung heavily over everyone. Another older man groaned softly, his trembling hand clutching a small cross around his neck, mumbling prayers, but he too did not dare to look up. Time seemed to stand still, but the plane did not. It kept falling. Every second of hesitation, every moment of doubt, meant they were getting closer to the inevitable end. Captain Elliot surveyed the scene before him, his chest tightening with an unprecedented sense of despair. In his long flying career, he had faced countless emergencies, but he had never felt so powerless as he did now. He looked at First Officer Mark, and the reality that passed between their eyes was clear and painful. They couldn't do anything unless someone stood up. Mark took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. His voice was hoarse as he tried again, his words pleading. "Please help. We don't have much time." But still, There was no response. Everything was silent. Everyone avoided his gaze. Fear had consumed them all. A woman sitting by the window began sobbing uncontrollably, pressing her face into her hands. "We're going to die? We're going to die." Her words echoed like a curse, haunting everyone in the cabin. Immediately, others began to cry too, sobs and fragmented prayers filling the air. But none of them had the courage to take on this challenge. Another flight attendant, trying to maintain professionalism, but her voice was shaking visibly, said, "We don't have time. We need someone." But no one answered. Some even turned their faces away, unable to face the truth that they had surrendered to fear. Elliot glanced toward the cockpit controls, where the numbers continued to fall relentlessly. The plane's altitude was dropping faster than ever. They were falling with an uncontrollable speed, and if they didn't act immediately, they would never touch down safely. But still, no one moved. No one stood up. No one dared to accept the task. They held their breath in fear, waiting for a miracle to happen, waiting for someone else to step in. But the truth was, without someone stepping up, there would be no miracle. Tom did not wait for anyone. The plane continued to fall, and with every passing second, they lost another chance to survive. But in the suffocating moment, still, no one dared to act. Fear had won. At least, that's what they thought. Inside the cabin, time seemed to freeze. The blaring alarm still rang out like the death toll, reminding everyone that they were plummeting straight toward the abyss of death. Each passing second, the plane lost more altitude, drawing them closer to the inevitable end. No one dared to stand up. No one dared to take on the responsibility that everyone knew was dangerously high. Fear had frozen them all. Kate held Jane tightly in her arms, trying to shield her daughter from the chaos around them. She could feel every tremble of her child's heartbeat, every shallow breath, and the small hands clutching her shirt. Kate knew Jane was terrified, but she didn't expect the next moment to change everything. Jane looked up at her mother, her clear eyes holding something that seemed out of place, a quiet determination, a resolve that seemed impossible for a 5-year-old. She took a deep breath, then slowly whispered, her voice small but ringing in Kate's mind like a storm, "I will do it." The cabin fell silent. A few people turned to look, their faces frozen in disbelief at what they had just heard. A child? A 5-year-old volunteering for the task that every adult on the plane had refused? Kate felt as though her entire body had frozen. She stared at her daughter, her eyes wide with shock. "No, Jane. It's too dangerous." Her voice cracked, filled with fear. She was too small, too fragile to do this. How could she let her daughter step into danger like that? But Jane didn't back down. She still held on to her mother, her eyes alight with a determination Kate had never seen before. "I don't want everyone to die." Her soft voice, but full of certainty, pierced the hearts of everyone around them. A sob broke from a young woman somewhere behind them. A man exhaled sharply, his gaze falling to the floor as if unable to face reality. No one could believe that in the midst of utter panic, the only person with enough courage to face death was a child who had only just begun to understand the world. Kate shook her head vigorously, her hands gripping Jane as if to keep her close. "No, I can't let you do this. You're too young." She wanted to scream, to cry, to beg someone else to stand in Jane's place. But when she looked around the cabin, all she saw were faces full of fear, eyes avoiding hers, trembling hands clutching seat belts as though they were the only things that could save them. No one would do it. Not a single one. Jane continued to look at her mother, but this time her gaze softened. The little girl reached up and gently touched Kate's face, her voice a whisper of reassurance. "Mom, I'll be okay." Kate's tears overflowed uncontrollably. Her heart felt like it was shattering into a million pieces. How could she let her daughter do this? How could she let a child bear a burden that hundreds of adults on this plane had refused to take on? But then, another hand rested on Kate's shoulder. Captain Elliot knelt down to be at eye level with the mother and daughter, his eyes full of compassion but also a deep seriousness. He knew better than anyone that this was their only chance. "Jane, are you sure?" His voice was warm but trembled, as even he couldn't believe he was asking this of a child. Jane nodded without hesitation. Elliot took a deep breath and then looked at Kate. "We will do everything we can to ensure her safety. I promise." Kate couldn't breathe. She felt as if she was being forced to make the most brutal decision of her life. Either lose her daughter forever or let her step into danger with the faintest hope that she might survive. Tears ran down her face, but in the end, all she could do was nod silently. Jane squeezed her mother's hand one last time, then slowly turned to face the astonished, fearful, but also hopeful eyes of the people around her. In that moment, a 5-year-old girl became the only hero on a plane falling to its doom. The cabin was thick with an oppressive silence after Jane's unimaginable decision. Every eye was on her. This tiny 5-year-old girl, now shouldering a responsibility no one else on the plane dared to accept. A child, on the brink of life and death amid the fear of hundreds of adults, had decided to do what no one had the courage to carry out. Kate knelt beside her daughter, her hands still gripping Jane's small shoulders as though by holding on tightly, she could keep her forever by her side. "Are you sure, sweetheart?" Her voice trembled, tears streaming down her pale face. Kate had never felt so powerless. She was Jane's mother, the one who should have protected her, but now she had to watch her daughter step into a place full of darkness and danger. Jane looked up, her eyes glowing with an unusual courage. "Mom, I'll be fine. Fine. I can do this." The little girl held her mother's hand, squeezing it lightly as if to reassure her. Unlike Kate, the little girl didn't cry, didn't shake, but there was a strange resolve in her eyes. Captain Elliot and First Officer Mark quickly gathered everything they needed. A flight attendant rushed over with a small radio, light enough for Jane to wear in her ear. The captain knelt down, gently placing the device in the little girl's ear. "Here," then spoke slowly, clearly. "Jane, you just need to follow Mark's instructions in the cockpit. We'll talk to you the whole time. You won't have to do anything alone, understand?" Jane nodded firmly. Another flight attendant handed her a small flashlight, its faint light the only thing that could guide her through the cramped maintenance compartment. Jane gripped it tightly, as if holding the faith of everyone on board. The atmosphere in the cabin grew more suffocating than ever. The passengers, who moments ago had been consumed by fear, now watched Jane closely, following every movement of the girl as if she were the last hope for all of them. Mark bent down, taking a deep breath, then began guiding Jane step by step. "Now, you'll have to crawl into a very small space. Once you're in there, follow my instructions. We need you to reconnect some wires to restart the system." "I know you're very brave, Jane." Jane pursed her lips, gripping the flashlight tightly in her hand, and nodded. Kate couldn't hold back anymore. She hugged her daughter tightly, as if this were the last time she could feel her warmth. "Sweetheart, I'm always with you." Her voice caught, her hand gently stroking her daughter's soft hair. Jane closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and then opened them, looking straight at her mother with unwavering determination. "I'll be right back, Mom." The captain signaled. A flight attendant bent down, opening the small door leading to the maintenance compartment. A cold gust of air rushed out. The space inside, pitch black, filled only with tangled wires and tiny sparks flashing from broken spots. The atmosphere there was nothing like anywhere else on the plane. It was cramped, stifling, and carried with it a chilling sense of terror. Jane tightened her grip on the flashlight, took a deep breath. No one spoke. No one dared to utter a word. And then, in the held breath of the entire cabin, Jane bent down, slowly stepping into the darkness. The space inside the maintenance compartment was completely different from the passenger cabin. While the cabin had dim lighting and the hum of voices, here there was only darkness, silence, and the cold fear creeping into every breath. The moment Jane stepped inside, she felt a sharp gust of cold air from somewhere, causing her skin to prickle. The space was so cramped that Jane had to crouch down, then slowly crawl in, each movement accompanied by the sound of her knees scraping against the cold metal floor. The only light in the maintenance compartment came from the tiny flashlight in Jane's hand. It cast a faint glow, just enough to reveal what was directly ahead. Everything else remained swallowed by darkness, a deep abyss that felt bottomless, where even a small mistake could trap Jane forever. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her breathing steady, but her heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it could be heard. Through her earpiece, the voice of First Officer Mark crackled to life. "Can you hear me clearly, Jane?" Jane flinched slightly at the sudden sound piercing through the air thick with suffocating tension. But she quickly nodded, then realized no one could see her. "Yes, I hear you clearly." Her voice was soft, but loud enough to come through the radio. Good job. Now stay calm. Keep moving forward. We're doing great. Jane gripped the flashlight tighter, bit her lip, and continued crawling deeper inside. The maintenance compartment was so narrow, just enough for a child like her to squeeze through the tiny gaps. Above her, thick, tangled wires hung down like black serpents lurking in the darkness, ready to constrict anyone who passed by. The crackling sound echoed somewhere, and Jane shuddered. It seemed like the electrical system was still short-circuiting, and if she touched the wrong wire, no one knew what could happen. From the radio, Mark's voice continued. "Are you still okay, Jane?" Jane nodded slightly, took a deep breath to steady herself, then answered, "Yes, I'm okay." But that wasn't entirely the truth. She was scared, very, very scared. But Jane knew she couldn't stop. Behind the maintenance compartment door, her mother was waiting. Hundreds of passengers were waiting. If she failed, none of them would ever have a chance to return home. Clenching her teeth, Jane kept moving forward. And then, when the flashlight illuminated further, she saw the destination right in front of her. The plane's main circuit board appeared, an intricate maze of dozens of wires crossing in every direction, looking like a giant spider's web ready to ensnare anyone who touched it. Jane took a deep breath, trying to keep her fear from controlling her. Her real task was only just beginning. First Officer Mark's voice came through, a bit more urgent than before. "Jane, do you see the main circuit board?" Jane stopped for a moment, sweeping the flashlight over the tangled mess of wires, her eyes intently focused on the small markings on the electrical boxes. She took a deep breath, then quietly replied, her voice trembling, "Yes, I see it." "Good. Now listen carefully. You need to find the blue wire with a white stripe running along its length. It's the main connection for the auxiliary control system. If you reconnect it, we can regain control." Mark's voice was slow but urgent, as they didn't have much time left. Jane scanned the mess of wires in front of her, dozens of different colored wires woven together like a tangled maze. She carefully moved the flashlight inch by inch, but her small hands were still shaking with worry. She couldn't afford to touch anything before confirming the exact location of the wire she needed to fix. Her breath quickened, and her heartbeat echoed in her head, making Jane feel like she was racing against time. Just then, a scream pierced the air from the cockpit, cutting through the internal speaker, making Jane's heart skip a beat. "We have 60 seconds before we lose safe altitude." Captain Elliot's voice was tense, slicing through the stillness of the maintenance compartment. Jane froze for a moment, her hands gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. 60 seconds. 1 minute to save everyone. She took a deep breath, reminding herself not to panic. If she lost control, if her hands trembled and she made a mistake, everything would end immediately. She focused her gaze on the tangled wires, sweeping the flashlight over them again, more focused than ever before. Small popping sounds came from somewhere in the plane, signaling that the systems were weakening. Everything was reaching its limit. And then, just as the flashlight passed over a narrow corner of the circuit board, Jane saw it. The blue wire with the white stripe running down its length. She barely breathed, quickly announcing over the radio, "I see it." Mark responded immediately, his voice still tense, but with a hint of relief. "Good job. Listen carefully, Jane. You need to connect the two ends of the wire. But remember, hold it tightly. If the connection isn't stable, the system won't reboot." Jane swallowed hard, slowly extending her hand. But as her tiny fingers touched the wire, a small spark flew up, causing her to flinch and pull her hand back. The heat from the spark burned her skin, but Jane couldn't let fear stop her. She took a deep breath, adjusted her position, and reached out again. Outside, Elliot's voice came through, this time even more urgent. 40 seconds. Jane gripped both ends of the wire, but the sweat on her hands made it slip slightly from her grasp. Her tiny heart seemed to be ready to leap out of her chest, but she knew she couldn't waste any more time. She took another deep breath, using every bit of strength to clamp the two ends of the wire together. Another spark flashed, but this time she didn't pull her hand back. She held on tighter, feeling the thin wires inside making contact. Those moments felt like they stretched on for eternity. The maintenance compartment was pitch dark, illuminated only by the faint light from Jane's small flashlight, which cast a weak beam over the tangled mess of wires before her. The constant beeping of the warning system echoed through the space, each pulse a harsh reminder that their time was running out. Outside, the plane still shook violently, the engines howling as though they too were fighting to keep the aircraft from plummeting into the abyss. Jane held tightly onto the blue wire with the white stripe, the one wire that could help the plane regain control. But as her fingers touched it, her body froze. The two severed ends of the wire still sparked, small flashes of light dancing in the cramped, stifling space. If she connected them wrong, a powerful spark could erupt, causing a massive electrical short, and everything would end immediately. Her hands trembled. Sweat poured down her forehead, dripping down to dampen her collar. Jane dared not breathe too deeply, as if even the slightest wrong move could shatter everything. In her ear, Mark's voice crackled through the small radio, urgent but trying to remain calm. "Jane, you're doing great. Now be very careful. Just connect the two ends of the wire. But remember, don't touch any exposed metal." Jane bit her lip, her tiny fingers gripping the ends of the wire, but she couldn't bring herself to move. The ticking sound of the still activated electrical system filled her ears, and she felt suffocated. Suddenly, a violent jolt threw Jane forward. Her forehead slammed into the metal wall, a sharp pain shooting through her head, but she had no time to cry. Outside, Elliot's voice screamed through the internal speakers, desperate. "We have 30 seconds before we lose safe altitude." 30 seconds. Jane froze. Her tiny heart raced, and her hands felt almost numb. A deep, suffocating fear overcame her. If she made a mistake, hundreds of people would die. She was only 5 years old, and she had never done anything this important before. How could she be sure she wouldn't make a mistake? How could she know she was doing it right? In that moment, her mother's voice rang out from outside. "Jane, sweetheart, I believe in you." Jane took a deep breath, trying to stay calm as the tiny spark still flickered from the two ends of the wire. Her small hands were drenched in sweat, but she knew that she couldn't let them shake now. She focused on every move, biting her lip, her eyes locked onto the blue wire with the white stripe hanging in front of her. This was the pivotal moment. If she made a mistake, everything would end. If she got it right, everyone would live. Outside the maintenance compartment, the plane continued to shake violently. Captain Elliot's voice screamed over the communication system, his voice breaking from tension. "We have 15 seconds left." Jane had no other choice. She squeezed the two ends of the wire, then summoned all her strength to press them together. At the moment the two ends of the wire touched, a massive spark erupted, lighting up the maintenance compartment in a flash. A rush of scalding heat poured out, making Jane instinctively squint her eyes, but she didn't let go. She held the connection tightly, even though her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. And then, a pulse of electricity surged through the system, traveling from the circuit board throughout the entire plane. In that fleeting moment, Jane felt a subtle vibration spread through the space, as if the plane had just woken up from a long nightmare. Immediately, the lights on the plane flickered back on. The passenger cabin lit up, no longer with the faint, flickering light, but with a bright, powerful glow full of life. In an instant, the entire plane was enveloped in a profound silence. Passengers gasped, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Everything was back. Then, a burst of cheers erupted throughout the cabin. Some people started crying, others shouted with joy. Sobs and laughter filled the air. A middle-aged man gripped his armrest, stammering in disbelief. Are we alive?" A young woman burst into tears in her husband's arms, tears streaming down her face. A flight attendant hugged her colleague, their voices choked with emotion. Inside the maintenance compartment, Jane collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking with exhaustion. But inside her, a wave of relief flooded through her. Even though her lungs hadn't yet caught up with a normal breath, she had done it. She had connected the wires successfully. From the radio, First Officer Mark's voice came through, trembling but full of joy. "Jane, you did it. The system has rebooted." In the cockpit, Captain Elliot stared at the control screens lighting up, each flickering signal like a miracle. Without wasting another second, he immediately yanked the control yoke, using every ounce of strength to pull the plane out of its free fall. The force of inertia pushed passengers into their seats, some screaming in panic as they felt the gravitational shift. But then, after what seemed like an eternity, the plane began to climb back up. A heavy silence descended over the entire cabin. A few passengers held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Some held on to each other, not daring to take their eyes off the windows. Then, Captain Elliot breathed a sigh of relief as he saw the control screens display the message he had been desperately searching for. Control full mode restored. System operating normally. The captain leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a brief second, as if he could finally allow himself to relax. Beside him, Mark could hardly believe his eyes, his hands still on the control panel, as if afraid this might be a dream. But no, this was real. They had survived. Inside the maintenance compartment, Jane still lay on the cold metal floor, her tiny chest heaving from exhaustion. But when she heard the applause and cheers outside, she smiled. Though her body was completely drained, she knew in her heart everyone was safe. From the passenger cabin, Kate could hardly hold back her tears. She covered her face, sobbing uncontrollably, her heart having just gone through the most terrifying moment of her life. A flight attendant ran to her, hugging her tightly, sharing this overwhelming emotion. The entire plane burst into joy, but more than anyone, Kate knew that the true miracle today didn't come from the electrical system. It came from a small girl with a heart braver than anyone else. Captain Elliot took the radio, his voice booming throughout the cabin, no longer tense or fearful, but filled with pride and emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, our flight is safe. A round of applause erupted like thunder. Passengers shouted with joy, strangers embracing each other, tears of happiness rolling down their faces. And Jane, though still lying on the floor of the maintenance compartment, could only smile weakly. But in her heart, she knew. Today, she had made a miracle. The announcement came through the loudspeaker across the cabin, but this time it was not a warning or panic. It was a single sentence that made everyone erupt with emotion. We are preparing to land. In that moment, no one could contain their feelings. Passengers clutched each other's hands. Some bowed their heads in prayer. Others couldn't hold back tears, overcome by emotion. Just moments ago, they had been on the brink of death, believing they might never return to their families. Yet now, they were about to touch the earth again, safe, whole, and alive. Outside the window, the bright lights of the airport were clearly visible against the night sky, the runways stretching out like a path back to a place they all thought they'd never reach again. Captain Elliot gripped the control yoke tightly, his eyes fixed on the runway ahead, carefully adjusting the speed. Prepare for landing. His voice steady but tinged with emotion. The wheels of the plane gently touched the runway and began to roll smoothly, gradually slowing down. In that moment, the entire cabin went silent, as though no one dared to believe what was happening. But the second the plane came to a full stop, everything erupted. Applause roared through the cabin, lasting far longer than anyone expected. Some people cried uncontrollably, embracing those around them. A middle-aged man repeatedly said, "We're alive. We're alive," as if he couldn't believe it. A young woman cried in her husband's arms, tears flowing down her cheeks as she whispered, "We're alive. We're alive." But amidst the emotional storm, one small figure became the focus of every gaze. Jane. The little girl sat in her mother's arms, her hair slightly messy, her eyes still red from the intense moments. But when everyone saw her, another round of applause erupted, even louder than before. No one could believe that a 5-year-old girl had just saved 275 people. But it was the truth. A man stepped forward, kneeling in front of Jane, his eyes filled with tears. "Little one, you truly are an angel." His voice cracked as he looked at her with absolute gratitude. Another woman stepped forward, then suddenly hugged Jane tightly. "You saved all of us." And then, like a chain reaction, passengers began to approach Jane one by one. They couldn't stop crying, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of appreciation, of joy, of something deeper than words. A tall man placed his hand on Jane's shoulder, his eyes red-rimmed. "Thank you, little one. Without you, we wouldn't have made it back." A flight attendant handed Jane a tissue, but before she could wipe her tears, Kate rushed to her, pulling her daughter into her arms. She cried, tears soaking into Jane's soft hair as she whispered, "My love, I'm so proud of you. More than anything in this world." Jane wrapped her little arms around her mother, and she too started crying. But this time it was in the safest embrace she'd ever known. In the cockpit, Captain Elliot removed his headset, his hands still trembling slightly. He looked at Mark, and they both understood. This was a moment they would never forget. Elliot stood up, stepped out of the cockpit, and slowly walked toward the cabin. As he appeared, the passengers immediately began to clap. Some bowed their heads in gratitude, thanking him for getting the plane safely down. But Elliot merely smiled softly, then knelt beside Jane, looking at her with deep pride. "Little one, today you didn't just save a plane. You saved all of us. You're a true hero." Jane shyly smiled, but when she saw the eyes around her, she understood she had done something monumental. A small smile spread across her face, even though her eyes were still teary. Outside at the airport, a fleet of emergency vehicles and ambulances waited. But when the ground crew saw the plane land safely, they couldn't believe their eyes. An experienced pilot standing near the runway, who had witnessed hundreds of landings, had never seen anything as miraculous as this. As passengers began to disembark, no one hurried. Some turned back, bowing their heads to Jane as a gesture of thanks. An elderly woman placed her hand on her heart, her voice shaking. "Little one, thanks to you, I get to see my grandchildren again. Thank you. Thank you." At that moment, something deeper than life and death spread through the air. It was the connection between people, the gratitude, the miracle that no one on this flight would ever forget. Because they weren't just saved. They had witnessed the purest bravery from a 5-year-old girl who no one could have imagined would become the hero of them all. In just a few hours after the plane landed safely, Jane's story had shocked the world. News outlets from every corner of the globe were broadcasting, "5-year-old girl saves 275 people," turning Jane from an ordinary little girl into a name known by millions around the world. Networks like CNN, BBC, and local stations continuously aired breaking news reports about the incident, with footage of the young girl, her face still wet with tears but shining with pride, becoming the center of attention. Unbelievable. A 5-year-old child did what even adults would never dare attempt, a CNN anchor exclaimed as he introduced a special segment on Jane. Reporters crowded the airport, desperately trying to interview passengers from the fateful flight. Those who had just escaped death shared the terrifying moment when they thought they had no chance of surviving and how a small girl became the only light in that desperate darkness. Sensational headlines flooded the newspapers. "A miracle in the sky. 5-year-old girl saves the flight from disaster. The young hero. The story that brings the world to tears. The brave girl who defied death. A true story that touches the heart." Even social media exploded. Video clips showing the plane's safe landing, the tears of passengers, and the moment Jane stepped out of the maintenance compartment attracted millions of views within hours. People couldn't stop sharing her story, expressing admiration and gratitude for her extraordinary courage. Politicians and celebrities also weighed in. A NASA astronaut tweeted, "Jane has proven that courage is not bound by age. We need more hearts as strong as hers." A tech billionaire posted, "This is a real hero. She teaches us that greatness can come from the smallest of us." Although Jane was still just a little girl, she had become a symbol of courage, admired by the world. The event not only moved the world, but also prompted the airline to take immediate action to honor Jane. The next day, they hosted a formal ceremony at their headquarters, where Jane and her mother were invited as honored guests. The hall was packed with reporters, airline officials, and many passengers who had been on that fateful flight. When Jane appeared, everyone stood up and clapped without hesitation. The little girl, slightly shy, held tightly to her mother's hand, her eyes still shining with the innocence of a child who didn't fully understand the magnitude of what she had done. The airline CEO stepped up to the podium, holding the microphone, his voice filled with emotion. "Today, we are here to honor a hero. A 5-year-old girl who did what none of us dared to do. Jane not only saved 275 passengers on that plane, but she taught the world the true meaning of bravery." The entire hall erupted into applause once again. The CEO signaled for a flight attendant to bring out a special airline ticket. He knelt in front of Jane, handing the ticket to her and saying, "On behalf of the airline, we are pleased to offer you a free flight for 1 year, anywhere you want to go." You and your mother will always have seats on our flight." The hall echoed with cheers. Many people moved to tears. Jane widened her eyes at the ticket, then turned to her mother with a look full of happiness. But that wasn't all. The government also presented her with an honorary certificate, recognizing Jane for her extraordinary act of courage. A representative stepped forward, looking down at Jane with pride. "Little one, you are not just the hero of that flight. You are a role model for the whole world." Jane didn't fully understand the words, but when she saw her mother smiling and tears rolling down her face, she knew that this was a moment she would never forget. But amid all the awards, applause, and prestigious titles, for Kate, the greatest reward wasn't the tickets or the certificates. It was being able to hold her daughter in her arms. As the ceremony ended and all the reporters and guests had left, Kate knelt in front of Jane, pulling her into a tight embrace. Tears fell again, but this time not from fear or worry, but from happiness beyond measure. "Jane, I'm so proud of you." The little girl looked up, gazing at her mother with bright, innocent eyes, then hugged her even tighter. "I love you, Mom." There were no flashing lights, no clapping, no cheering crowds, just the two of them in that moment, holding each other so tightly as if nothing else in the world mattered. And Jane, even though she was only 5 years old, had learned something. No matter how much the world acknowledges you, the most important thing will always be a mother's love, family, and moments like these, full of warm hugs. Outside, the sunset bathed the sky in a soft orange glow. A new chapter in Jane's life had begun, a chapter where she was no longer just an ordinary child, but a young hero celebrated by the world, yet still a child in her mother's arms. The story of Jane is a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear armor or possess supernatural abilities. Sometimes, they are simply a small child with a big heart, an ordinary person who rises when the world falters. Jane wasn't a pilot, an engineer, nor an expert in aviation. She was just 5 years old. Yet, her courage and determination changed the fate of 275 people. Jane's story is not just an extraordinary event in the sky. It's a strong reminder that bravery can come from anyone, anywhere. In the most desperate moment, when everyone was consumed by fear, it was that tiny girl who stepped forward, faced danger, knowing that one small mistake could end it all. But Jane did not back down. Perhaps around the world, there are many heroes like Jane, ordinary people with extraordinary hearts. They don't seek glory nor titles, but their actions change the lives of so many. They could be a courageous child like Jane, a mother willing to sacrifice for her child, or a stranger who lends a helping hand in times of need. Do you believe that a 5-year-old girl can do the unimaginable? If this story touched your heart, click subscribe now so you won't miss out on more emotional and dramatic stories like this one. Because who knows? One day, you may be the hero in someone's story.